it doesn't matter if you have the best analysis in the world. If you can't explain it to the other person, then it's meaningless. It's useless. If you use it to get the job that you don't deserve in a way because you've just cheated too much, then I think you're cheating yourself out of an opportunity, because eventually you will be found out. What's most important when I talk to candidates is, are they curious people? Do they take ownership and responsibility for what they do? And then are they willing to take feedback? The humility to accept that, oh, I don't know much, but I'm willing to listen and I'm not going to assume I know the answer.
Ron, do you feel there's a balance between technical skills and soft skills for data roles? Where do you think that balance is? Maybe more interesting is, how's that changing with AI, do you view?
I guess in the space that I work in, which is health and more specifically real world evidence and real world data health, the hard skills, the technical skills is important. But I've always had this mantra, which is, it doesn't matter if you have the best analysis in the world. If you can't explain it to the other person, then it's meaningless. It's useless. So that communication, that soft skill, being able to present, is becoming more and more critical, as particularly I think as we move into the AI type age, where you can quite quickly, with the help of AI, write SQL scripts, write Python scripts. So my sense is that those soft skills becoming more and more important.
Yeah, with ChatGPT picking up the slack of the basic bits. I wonder if then it sounds like the profile of who would typically be hired into a data analyst, data scientist role might also change. If the blend of skills is going to be different.
Yeah, I think so. I've always hired with a very strong intent of ensuring that the candidate has curiosity, and I think more than ever now, particularly that curiosity to go play with the new tool, to go play with prompts, to go test out features. I think that is the foundation of being a really good analyst or a really good data person.
Especially if we're in, let's assume, this kind of precipice of a very significant change in the way things are done. I guess if you don't carve out time to actually play around a little bit with these other tools, you might find yourself very quickly left behind and doing things in a way that's now been 10x'd if you use AI to do the same task.
Yeah, definitely. I remember when, like, before AI came out, when I was much younger, I still felt that way in terms of, oh, I should really go spend time to go learn the latest Python and the latest SQL command, or whatever is hot right now, the latest visualization tools. But I think now more than ever, given the rate of change is evolving so rapidly, it's much, much more important to carve out that bit of time to go be curious and go test, to go play. It's, yeah, harder to rely on remaining static now.
I've spoken to a few people at a few different companies recently, I think three of them, that have basically said to their entire company, these are companies and sometimes thousands of people, stop working, don't do anything for the next month, just use Claude or ChatGPT and rethink everything you're doing day to day. And it's a really interesting approach, which is quite bold. And I don't remember, certainly in my career, any point where there's been any new technology that's come along where companies have said something like that. And I guess the idea is to have like a step change in productivity in the way people are doing things, and kind of almost like a forcing function. Like, you could be so busy doing busy work, but if you don't have the time to actually explore these tools and how they apply in your day-to-day life, then it could be easy to miss out on them. Can you imagine that approach working well? This kind of, well, let's just implement it across the board as quickly as possible.
Um, yes and no. I think it sounds like an interesting idea. I suppose in health, it's still quite, the data is still quite complex and so to be good with health data, you need to be good with analytics. You need to have some domain knowledge, and of course, the soft skills of communication. I don't feel like GPT or AI is at the stage yet where it can replace a lot of those skills. I think it augment. So I think there's definitely benefits in using it to augment and make your job a bit faster, more efficient. but I don't know about replacing just yet. So the idea of just stop what you're doing and go for it, it might work, but I think a lot of guardrails need to be put in place on how you implement it and how you use it.
Particularly if you're using health data, I guess you can't just start pumping in people's sensitive health data to the cloud and asking an AI to come back with an answer.
Definitely. But even take a simpler use case. In the data that we collect in my program, we collect a lot of drug names, and the drug names are written in by the doctors. So doctors like to abbreviate, they like to use acronyms, they like to use shorthand. And we use AI to help us just at first pass to tell us what you think is closest match. And sometimes the matches aren't even close. So without that domain knowledge, you would just assume, oh yeah, that seems correct. And then you would make a completely incorrect conclusion.
Where do you see AI most improving the hiring process? Have you seen it have any impact already? Like when you've been hiring roles yourself, what do you see? What are your thoughts there?
Um, Not in the space that I hire in. And again, I work for relatively small organizations in a relatively complex data environment. Not just yet. So still we are doing the traditional take-home assignments and having that interview process where the candidate presents back to us. Not to say that we're ignorant of the fact that with a take-home assignment, we expect the candidates to run it through GPT. So I think the standard of what we're expecting is a lot higher nowadays, but not necessarily having it replace what we do.
And so you say you'd still be doing the, let's say, application, CV screen, initial interview, take-home test, technical interview, like that type of process?
For now. And I think part of it is because in the space that I work, it's still relatively niche. So for any given role, there might only be, let's say, I'd be very happy to receive 10 resumes that were worthwhile.
So yeah, that's interesting. So I think about other people I've spoken to recently, maybe in broader analytics areas, they are just getting inundated with CVs. Their main complaint is, I'm getting 500 applications. I could read them manually. I would read them and probably reject 450 of them manually. I literally cannot read them. I have to have some tool to do that kind of first pass for me. But it sounds like for you, because maybe the market of potential candidates is quite narrow because they need the health domain experience as well as the analytic skills. So then, yeah, you don't have that kind of screening issue at the moment.
Yeah. Health analytics is generally a bit smaller in terms of the scale of organizations that exist. Definitely, as you say, the hard skills, the sort of domain knowledge, being able to, and you don't have to be an expert in, I work in cancer research right now. You don't have to be an expert in oncology, but a year 12 understanding of biology and the ability to quickly adapt and quickly learn if I tell you about a particular therapy area is really important. And then on top of that, we're also looking for all-rounders where they can communicate, they can ideally do a tiny bit of project management on the side as well. So that makes it so that we're not so uniform in what we're looking at in terms of skill sets.
What about then thinking about what's possible? So if we think of where LLMs are at the moment, is there any step in the hiring process that you could imagine them being helpful in? Or maybe not even thinking about current steps, but like, oh, what is imperfect about the way we do hiring? What opportunities might there be for AI to help, for example, things like, I don't know, giving feedback to candidates or something like that?
It's a good question. So you mean like using LLMs to speed up the hiring process in a way?
So, for example, some companies, okay, they're now using an LLM to do that CV screening. So they'll get the CV, they'll give it some kind of grading relative to the job description. And so they'll say, okay, this is I don't know, a score of 80 versus a score of 60. Here's its relative strengths and weaknesses. What I assume these companies are then going to do is share some of that information back with the candidates, because you could, instead of just giving them a rejection email, you could say, hey, we rejected your application, but here's the areas why we rejected it. Here's how you could improve in the future. So there's probably some kind of ability to do feedback. Not that they're doing it yet, but I imagine that's where it's going to get you quite quickly. What about are there other things in the hiring process you feel like, either from your experience as a candidate or as a hiring manager, that, oh, wow, like this is ripe for a bit of disruption. Like this could really be improved potentially in the not too distant future with AI?
I personally use LLM to help me actually screen and draft up that interview process. And to ensure that, for example, if I'm writing a job description or position description, that I've got the key elements covered and what else I'm not thinking about. That's where I find it very useful to articulate the things I don't know and things I've missed. Um, in terms of using it to screen candidates and particularly provide feedback, I'm not sure. I feel like it's a bit of a Brave New World situation going on there. It's, I would like to think if I've spent the time speaking to someone, they give me, their own feedback rather than an auto-generated feedback from a program.
Oh, yeah, you're right. At the interview stage, I feel like that the average candidate would expect human customized feedback. You're right. Maybe at the earlier stages where it's just that you've just applied, you've completed an application and a CV, typically you get back just what I call a sorry, not sorry email. So maybe it's one step improvement on that might be AI. Yeah, it's not human, but maybe it's better than nothing at least.
Hopefully the candidates are doing it themselves though. That if they're not getting the job, they're feeding that job description and their own resume and going, why do you think I didn't get this job?
Yeah, there you go. That would be the kind of humble and smart approach to the rejection, I guess, is to take that upon yourself to self-improve. I personally feel like the current narrative in the market is one of increasing paranoia from both sides. A lot of companies are saying, oh, all these candidates are cheating with ChatGPT. Every CV I get seems to deviate a lot from reality. Candidates are saying, oh, the ATS is filtering out my CV. The company's rejecting me unfairly, blah, blah, blah. So I feel like candidates aren't in a good mindset to have that humility to almost step back and go, oh, how could I improve? How could I improve my odds of getting a job next time? But I agree, they probably should at some level.
Yeah, it's hard when I wouldn't say cheat, but when candidates leverage these tools in unfair ways and potentially misrepresent themselves, like I can imagine the frustration. You read a cover letter, you read a resume, and it sounds really good, and the reality doesn't reflect it when you go through the interview process or even when you've hired the person. I guess it goes back to the importance of having those soft skills and having to be able to communicate and articulate what it is that you've done, the impact that you've had, because you can sort of get away with pretending to have the hard skills now.
Yeah, and someone pointed out to me the other day that actually maybe ChatGPT could be just as helpful for the soft skills, at least soft written skills, to someone who's got amazing technical skills, but is a bit too humble, doesn't know what companies are looking for, maybe hasn't quantified their achievements well enough. You could argue maybe an LLM could be just as good at helping them craft their own message as it would be for someone with soft skills to do some of the basic technical stuff. What do you reckon?
Not so well. The first thing that came to my mind was it's not so much the communication of the soft skills or being able to persuade you that my analysis is the one you should follow. It's, does the person doing the analysis or doing the work understand the business context in which they're operating? So in theory, yes, if you understood the business context, if you understood the project and you fed that all into the LLM, you might get a response that made sense. But my guess is chances are the candidate may not understand those things, and that's why they're struggling, not because they can't get the LLM to help them.
It's interesting because we both in passing mentioned kind of cheating, or I think you used the word leveraging the technology. How do you view candidates using AI tools in the hiring process? Is it completely fair game? Is it completely off the table? Is it you should use them because you're going to use them in the job? Like, how do you philosophically think about that?
I expect them to use it like any other tool that's available now. So if they're not using it, then I'd be asking why not.
And is there any limit to that? So I'll give you an example. So we were recently hiring for some roles, sales roles they were. And one of the questions in our evaluation process was, I think it was, imagine it's day one for you at our company, Alooba. What are the 3 things you need from us to give you the best chance of being successful? It's a question that to me was very personalized. Like I wanted to know their exact specific opinion to them so I could tailor an onboarding program for that human. And it was striking how many candidates clearly had used ChatGPT for that question, which I found very odd because I'm like, I don't give a shit what an LLM thinks about this. I care what you think. I'm trying to form a relationship with you personally. But then someone said to me, well, yeah, but candidates probably view that as part of the evaluation like anything else. So if they answer that question poorly, they could easily not get to that next stage of the hiring process. So I hadn't thought of that. I'm like, oh, okay, fair enough. So it's just like part of the game, part of the test. From your perspective, is there any limit on where candidates should be using these tools in the hiring process? Like if they were doing a remote interview and sitting there typing stuff into ChatGPT, would that be too much? Is there any limit?
It's a good question, and it's hard to draw that line. I would almost say there isn't, with the caveat of if you use it to get the job that you don't deserve in a way because you've just cheated too much, let's say, or you leveraged it too much, let's say, then I think you're cheating yourself out of an opportunity because eventually you will be found out and you probably won't make it past probation. Um, However, in the interview setting, if someone, to your question around the top three things that you want them to do to help them on board faster or help them on board better, if they used a language model to give me the answer, I think it's about probing. It's about that sincerity or that fidelity, if you will, of what you said and does it actually reflect your reality, and asking why. Why is it that meeting the broader team is really important to you on your first day, or whatever it is that they've asked for?
Yeah, the sincerity thing is interesting. I'm reminded of another person who had used the tool to develop a strategy for their part of the business, let's say a product strategy or sales strategy, but they presented it as if they'd created it themselves. So, oh, I spent the weekend creating this product strategy or whatever, but it was clearly just a 1 minute prompt into GPT and an export. Not saying that the end result wasn't of some value, but I felt like, oh, that's a bit disingenuous because you're presenting some work that it's kind of like plagiarism in a way. It's almost as if you gotten your friend to do it. What's the difference in a sense? Which felt uncomfortable for me seeing that. Do you feel like at least candidates should be forthcoming in how and why they've used the products?
Um, I mean, it would be nice if they did, but even if they didn't, you can tell. You can tell because I did something similar. Not that I cheated, but I was writing the data strategy for my company, and I thought, well, let's see what GPT has to say about this. And it was, it was a solid 6 out of 10, but it wasn't close. It wasn't specific enough. It didn't take into account a lot of the context in which I'm working. And it feels bland. It feels generic. It feels heartless in a way, or soulless. So you can kind of tell when people do that, and it just makes you look a bit silly. It makes you look like your answer is half baked. And what's worse is you're going to probe this candidate on, well, why did you do that? Why did you say that? And if they can't give you a good response, then it's a very strong sign.
Particularly if the thing you're asking them about involves any level of their view, their opinion. Like I'm asking you, this is your piece of analysis. What's your business recommendation? Are we going to buy this or not? Are we going to move into this market or not? It's got to be your, you got to own that in a certain level. And so, yes, that must be incredibly apparent if they haven't created themselves in those probing questions, as you say.
Exactly. And I guess, on the other hand, if it's to create, if you give them some data tables and you're asking them, hey, write me a SQL script to extract this output, I'm not particularly fussed as to how it's done, provided they understand it, and provided that if I ask them to modify it, they're able to do so. But how to get there initially, that I'm not fussed.
And then maybe that's another key, actually. So in those examples, so you as a data expert use GPT to create a first pass at a data strategy, which saved you 50 hours thinking it from scratch. And then you could go and take it from a 6 to a 10 out of 10, let's say. But someone with no experience in data at all would have bunged it into GPT, gotten the 6 out of 10 or 5 out of 10 and go, oh, this looks pretty good, because they're not in a position to know otherwise. Maybe that's critical to then, it's a tool that people who are already expert can leverage to make them just to make their lives easier, basically.
Definitely. And we always use GPT where I work at Omico as a first pass. It's a great tool to create a draft. And we must always remember it's a draft. It's always a 5 or 6 out of 10 draft.
Yeah, that is the scary part, and I think part of it is that its grammar is flawless. So if you're a kind of grammar cop like I am, and you can spot your own typo and spelling from a mile away, and you get something that just is on point, formatting, grammar, spelling, everything is absolutely perfect, then it's even more deceptive in a way, I guess, because it's got the presentation of something that feels authentic.
Yeah, it writes well. It but you give it 5 minutes of critical thinking, and then you realize, oh, actually, this doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Uh, Thinking a little bit more broadly now about hiring and the kinds of people you look for, what you evaluate. What is your view on cultural fit? I feel like it's been a kind of buzz term, particularly in the HR circles for the last 10 years. I have very mixed feelings over cultural fit. How do you view it? Is it important to you? If so, how do you measure it?
It's a good question. So first off, yes, it is important to me, but I think the definition of cultural fit here is to do with the values that the person has on how they approach their work. So, as I said before, curiosity is really important, I find, or I think. So is the ownership and the level of responsibility the person is willing to take on their work. So I don't know if you'd call them cultural items or whether or not they call you like just your work ethic or your work values. But for me, what's most important when I talk to candidates is, are they curious people? Do they take ownership and responsibility for what they do? And then are they willing to take feedback?
And how do you evaluate these? Are these things you're sort of probing for in the interview? For example, for the feedback one, do you sort of just dump some negative feedback on them and just see what happens?
Um, Sometimes, but usually you ask around it. So curiosity, you might ask, well, like, give me an example of an approach you took on a problem or a project, and what are some other ways you could have done it in retrospect, and see if they can think of any. Um, Responsibility and particularly uh, communication, they're harder. Some of them are quite hard to tell during an interview. And the reality is, measuring success on these things, it's tough because you don't know until probably 3 to 6 months in whether or not you've made the right hiring decision. I always say that, when I hire candidates, sometimes 2, 3 round interviews, and it's a 50-50. Sometimes we make great decisions. Sometimes you're like, oh my God, how did I not pick that up? And you miss it.
I'm laughing because we've all been there, but I'm also a big fan of football. And I heard an interview on the weekend with David Moyes. He used to manage Man United and Everton and West Ham, all these big clubs. Like, he's managed 1,000 Premier League games or something ridiculous. And they're asking him about some of the players he'd signed and were there any that he regretted and how quickly did he know? And he said for some of them, it was literally their first training session where he goes, oh my God, what have I done? And they've spent £10 million. So if in that level of investment, it's still a flip of a coin at some level, then yeah, I think we can all be excused for not making the perfect hiring decision every time for our 100K a year data roles.
Yeah. And the reality is, you have what, 2, 3 hours at most to make that decision. And everyone's, you're in a process where both parties are new to each other. Everyone's probably a bit guarded and everyone's trying to put their best foot forward. So it makes sense.
And in that process, are you trying to explicitly measure cultural fit? So you mentioned 3 of those values. Are they things candidates would then be scored against on a rubric? How do you actually approach deciding who has or has not met those criteria?
Traditionally, when I have interviews with candidates, I have 2 round interviews. First round is going to be technical. It's around, can you do the job? And the second round interview is solely dedicated on, will you do the job? Do you have fit? So fit, I'm not just looking, yes, obviously the 3 components that I talked about: curiosity, ownership, willingness to take feedback. But also then it's, how do I think this person will get along with the rest of the team as well? Again, having that, because I don't work in a large organization, everyone in my team needs to be able to work effectively together. I've made mistakes in the past where I've hired that super competent, super technically amazing, brilliant, genius type person. First week into it, I just regretted it massively. I was just, oh my God, this person can't work with others, that they just can't communicate well. They think their way's the best way and the only way to do things. And it's a horrible situation to be in.
Yeah, I'm laughing again because I've had the identical experience. I'm sure we all have. I used to work at a business that was, I'd say, dominated by curious geniuses who were very challenging to work with. They added incredible value in a certain scenario, but I feel like almost it was once the company was at a certain stage in terms of its scale that it just didn't work anymore because you couldn't over rely on one person kind of just running as a lone wolf.
Yeah. And it doesn't require a big company to hit that stage. The moment you hit 3, 4, 5 people, you're already there in a team.
What about thinking back to some of the candidates you've interviewed who maybe haven't made it, the ones you didn't hire? Uh, any recurring themes among that set of candidates? Any kind of reasons why they would typically not be hired? And does that connect to any misconceptions those types of candidates might have about the process? For example, the ones who've just focused exclusively on technical skills, they've just done their 100 hours of Udemy and they've kind of neglected the other bits of the business. Yeah. Can you think of any typical types of characters you've come across?
Oh, there are a few. So yes, people over rely on technical skills is one. The other group that I tend to see a bit is people who are very hand wavy about what they do in their role, and they can't be specific about their contribution. So, I worked on a big project together, and it was $100 million project, and yeah, it was great outcomes. You go, what did you do exactly? Oh, I did a bit of analysis, project management, and I dealt with the client. Okay, so what did you achieve as a result of that? Oh, collectively the project was great. The client was super happy, and okay, well, thanks. You haven't really told me much. Um, that's one that immediately raises hairs on my back, and went, oh, that's going to be a no.
That's just to pick up on that kind of type. Let's call them a type for a second. That sounds almost like your sort of talking points, politician, high level positioning. I wonder if in candidates, then I just thought of this right now, should they almost be thinking of different audiences in their interviews? Because they can have a very different experience interviewing with you versus interviewing with a typical recruiter or a typical HR person. In all likelihood, you're probably going to get into more details, more technical side of things. You're going to really interrogate what they've done. Whereas maybe on average, someone in talent acquisition is looking for slightly higher level things. They don't want to get into the details of a model. And so maybe they've almost optimized their process for their kind of 15-minute quick chat, whereas they need to also have an in-depth ability to back that up. What do you reckon?
But I hadn't considered it that way before, but that does make a lot of sense. I would say also to candidates who perhaps are more junior or have worked on big projects and maybe they haven't contributed all that much, is to also just be upfront. Say, yeah, I worked on a big project, but my role was just to, I don't know, do something very small on the side. And that's okay. Because I did that role well and I did it. I took responsibility for that piece. That's the thing that end of the day, I think a lot of people are looking for when they're hiring, is that ability to learn and to engage. Because the likelihood is candidates have never done what they've been asked to do before in a new role.
And even if they had a very small piece of a very big project, presumably then still being able to quantify something, some demonstration that at least for their unit, they delivered some kind of value, whatever that metric was, rather than talking in vagaries would help their cause.
Definitely, 100%.
So apart from that particular type, someone is maybe just operating at a superficial level, doesn't give enough details, is, I wouldn't say inauthentic, maybe that's a bit harsh, but like can't quite get into the nuts and bolts of what they've contributed.
Well, it just makes it sound like they're lying a bit because they can't tell me what they've done. They just touch this very broad project. The other type I would say that I have come across are people who fail the second round interview. So those are people who are just far too sure of themselves, far too, almost morally superior, if you will, that they don't make mistakes or they took the best method and they know they did the best thing ever, or they made the best decision. Um, and there's always a question, well, how do you know you've made the best decision? How is that even possible? So they're the people that they typically run into the two heads are smarter than one type issue that I spoke about before.
And do you sense then it's a lack of humility on their part, or is it they feel like this is the best strategy to get the job? Or, yeah, where do you think the gap is?
So the gap for me is it would be a tell for they lack retrospection. They don't retrospectively think about what they've done or how they've done it. Maybe they're very good at forward looking, but they also aren't very good at backwards looking. Maybe they're doing it to impress, and maybe it would work on some people, but unfortunately for them, I don't get impressed by it.
It's probably also a market-based thing as well, isn't it? Like I can imagine, it's probably drawing stereotypes now, but a sort of American style of culture, business culture is a bit more in your face, a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more salesy. Maybe that would dominate more than a slightly humbler tech startup in Australia. Maybe there's just a different expectation of how they would behave as well, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so. It's hard during interviews. We've all been there. Not only are you trying to answer the question well, you're also trying to establish that connection with your interviewer. So being able to be able to clue in and go, hey, maybe Ron doesn't actually like people who are too boastful, and people who like the people who are a bit more humble and can retrospect a bit would be important. But I take your point; it is difficult.
You'd think if they'd done agile methodology, that would be baked in, isn't it? Like sprints that normally end with a retrospective meeting every 2 weeks, thinking about what you could have done better. Could you do better? A lot of tech companies do meditation. Well, it's all about reflection. You would hope that, yeah, if they could connect that to their interview performance, then they could learn some lessons, perhaps.
Yeah, I agree with you, Tim. We're not asking for that much, are we?
Speaking of not asking for too much, what about hiring people with no domain knowledge at all of your industry?
The most important thing is curiosity and willingness to learn. So I have a great story around this, which is one of my colleagues that I used to work with, and she has since gone to another company, but I hold her in very high regard. And she works in health, real world evidence, looking at she does all sorts of complex working with health data. She started her journey looking at metals and alloys and figuring out how to best make. I don't even know what she did actually. She did a PhD in metallurgy, and if she can switch careers and jump into health data and be highly regarded, I think a lot of people can.
Yeah, for sure. And at the end of the day, data's data. Every business has a conversion funnel. Every business has, a warehouse, and you need the same technical skills, and the curiosity applies equally, no matter what the domain. I feel like domain knowledge is there's a pro and a con to it. Like if you hire someone from industry, they've been in industry for their entire careers, all they know is that industry. Presumably the learning curve is zero, so that's a massive benefit. But maybe myopic, you could argue, especially if it's like a more traditional industry. Whereas coming from outside, you could add a fresh perspective, perhaps.
It can be certainly being dogmatic to the domain knowledge of your last role would be a problem. I think where the benefit is awareness of how that ecosystem that you're working in operates. So to give a really solid example, I'm working in health data. It's really nice when candidates come and they already know how hospitals and on general practice and specialists, how that health system all integrates together, because they can look at the data we have and draw insights from it that I probably didn't know before. I'm like, oh, that's a really good point. I didn't think of that. But yes, being very dogmatic around this is how we should analyze the data. This is how we should interpret it. That is problematic.
I wonder if, thinking about it now, we're going to get more people working in analytics who are domain experts and can now leverage a tool like ChatGPT to do the technical stuff they never knew how to do or was too difficult based on their skill set. And so now we're going to get Yeah, people who know the ins and outs of their business or their product or their function so well, and now they're going to get this cool tool that helps them do the stuff they couldn't do before.
I think we'll move there eventually. I don't know when, but that concept of sort of like no code programming and it's been on the horizon for quite some time, but slowly we're shifting there. So yeah, maybe one day, analytics will be just someone who's really good at asking questions around the data rather than actually, manipulating tables and spreadsheets or whatnot.
I spoke to someone this morning actually who's doing a little interesting project in their company. Their goal over the next month or so is to see, can they make their data analytics function obsolete by using GPT. So they're going to trial all these different tools that claim to be GPT on top of your warehouse or dashboarding or whatever. He'd used some already, thought, oh my God, these are 10 years away, so this is maybe not going to work, but they're going to press on. And the idea is to have almost like that self-service thing for ad hoc queries. You can just do the large level, the natural language to get your data back. I feel like this is the sort of thing that it's got disaster written all over it at a certain level, but eventually we'll probably get there.
It sounds wonderful. My question is, who's around to tell you that your interpretation's wrong or the output's rubbish?
I can think of, I worked years as an analytics professional, and the difference between a left join and an inner join in 100 lines of SQL code can be the difference between it being completely wrong or perfectly right, and off by orders of magnitude. And something as subtle as that, you could never possibly know unless you knew exactly how the tables connected to each other. So the number of different possible errors you could make is almost infinite. But devil's advocate would be maybe in businesses where they have like one analyst serving 100 people, then at the moment, a lot of people will be getting no answers at all, or not even trying to do a data-driven way. They're just kind of gut feeling the whole way. So maybe better to have 10 answers, 8 of them are bullshit, 2 of them are right. And there's better than was before. I don't know.
Look, if that's your situation, then I think your organization has broader challenges than not enough analysts. It has a data culture or data strategy issue.
Can you think in your past of any particularly tough hiring decision you had to make? And if so, what factors did you consider when you're making that tough hiring decision?
Tough hiring decisions. So are we talking about unsure of the candidate or candidates where they're both similar or?
This could be someone who you've hired and regretted. This could be someone who you haven't hired and regretted. This could be someone who maybe you had 2 amazing candidates, you could only hire one of them. Any time that you're kind of caught at a bit of a crossroads maybe and had to make a tough call.
Yeah, look, the biggest regrets I've made is, and I think I said it before, is hiring those super smart, technically super smart and capable people who I think, oh, great, like if they could come in, they could implement all this amazing stuff that they've done before. And, some of them, oh, look at, they've done, the pattern recognition and images, and they've done all sorts of they've been involved in all sorts of sophisticated research programs. And it's true, they're technically very gifted. Is the main regret is they fail to grasp the core concepts of the business. And that's a challenge. Actually, the inverse is also true for me, where I've hired people who are culturally, if you will, a very good fit, but technically very poor. And we've been able to actually train those people, and it takes time to train them up technically, but because they had a good understanding of the business and they're willing to learn and they had the right aptitude to fit into the business, they actually ended up really well. It actually worked out fantastically.
And presumably for those people, they must have had the mindset to realize they needed to learn some technical skills and then want to do it as well.
And the humility to accept that, oh, I don't know much, but I'm willing to listen and I'm not going to assume I know the answer.
Yeah. So that almost growth mindset, I guess you call it these days. And was that something you knew during the hiring process, or were you sort of pleasantly surprised by that once they joined and saw, oh, wow, actually, they're really going for it?
It was a gamble. So for that particular candidate I'm thinking of, it was a bit of a gamble. They had sort of come from an adjacent domain that was, they would be able to learn the business or the technical concepts fast enough, but they'd never been an analyst before. I was actually hired to a consultant role. They'd never been a consultant before. Um, but I could sense that they were, I wouldn't say desperate. They were really willing to give it a go. I don't know anything about this field, but I'm willing to learn, willing to give it my best shot. I'm willing to apply myself to do that. And it really worked, really came through, and it was one of the best hires we had.
What about thinking now in terms of diversity? Uh, have you seen any interesting or innovative ways any companies have gone about improving the diversity of how they source talent?
I think since COVID, my general feeling is that it's improved. It's improved because people are more mindful when they look for talent to be that almost talent centered, if you will, because we know that we can work from home now, and it's a method that works. But then also they're more willing to accept that everyone has their own life, their own circumstance. So I think in more broad terms, it's improved. I don't know about specifics. Nothing comes to my mind immediately when you say that.
Well, I mean, the one you've touched on, I feel like, is potentially the most profound one. If you can hire people remotely, then suddenly the potential candidate pool is astronomically larger. So, an example in an example, sorry, in our business, we basically are anyone from anywhere in the world. So that if you think of people's diversity across different geographies, then that's a pretty easy way to get, well, maybe not easy, but a kind of big bang for your buck there. So the fact that you would have remote hiring, I think, does make a big improvement, especially for people who might not live in the middle of the city or live near the office. Um, uh, I remember seeing some research around also people with physical disabilities, and the improvement in their odds of getting roles during COVID during a remote interview process was astronomically high. So I feel like it opened up some opportunities for people who were previously quite disadvantaged.
Yeah. And I don't know about you, Tim, but for me, we have remote workers and it's fantastic, but it does present additional management opportunities and challenges because it becomes more of a question of, okay, if people aren't in the office together sharing that same physical space, how do we promote that, team spirit or team culture? How do we effectively update each other? Still, video conference calls aren't as authentic, if you will, than in-person meetings. So it's still a bit harder. So I think there are management challenges that, and maybe we accept that there's going to be a 5 or maybe 10% even drop off in efficiency because everyone's remote. But we gain that through diversity and we gain that through other ways. So I don't know. That's a tough one in many ways.
Yeah, I agree. There's nothing like meeting in real life in the 3 dimensions. Having recently met some of our team who I hadn't seen since they started working for us because they live in other continents, and then seeing them in IRL, giving them a hug was a pretty nice moment. So being able to do that on a regular basis would be better. But then, yeah, it's definitely a trade off, because if you can hire remotely, then the size of your talent pool is like 1,000x immediately bigger than if you can only hire within 20 kilometers of your office. So it can be such a game changer.
Yeah. And I actually think so. I have a rule where it's fine if you work remote or if you live remotely, then um, at least once a quarter we meet in person as a team and we sit next to each other and have those water cooler conversations. And we have a ritual where we go out for lunch. So I work at UNSW, so along Anzac there's tons of nice Asian restaurants. So we usually go to one of them, and I'm always pleasantly surprised at just the spontaneous, curious questions that come up and the fantastic ideas. Like, why did we not talk about this sooner? And they just come up over lunch. I think that speaks to the power of having people in the same space, which is harder with remote staff, but there are ways around it.
Yeah, and I feel like with meeting people in real life, there's almost like a diminishing returns. And if you meet people once a quarter in an in-depth way, you have a night out, you have a long lunch, something like that, that can be almost as valuable as seeing them, I don't know, 3 times a week for 3 months. It's because it's more about the quality rather than the quantity, I found.
Yeah, no, I'd second that. And it's deliberately putting time away much like doing retrospection, um, deliberately putting time away to have those water cooler conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. My final question for you, Ron, would be, and this is dumping a bit of a strange one on you. Is there anyone you consider to be a hiring hero to you, or anyone that you've seen do hiring very well in the past? This could be a person, could be a company, and if there's no one in particular that springs to mind, what would this hiring hero mythical character look like, do you think?
I'm trying to think if I have a hiring heroes. I don't have any single organization or person in mind, but if I were to, amalgamate all of them into one person, I would say it's something like hiring them so that the reality is when you hire someone, you're going to have to work with them really closely. So I'd want to be comfortable if I'm hiring someone that I would be able to go to the pub with them afterwards. And maybe one day I can report to them. If I'm comfortable with these two things, then I think it's going to be okay.
Awesome.